How did Helaena die in the books? House of the Dragon Season 3 Episode 8 explained. Warning. Spoiler warning. This video contains major spoilers for House of the Dragon Season 3 Episode 8 and George R.R. Martin's Fire and Blood, including Helaena Targaryen's death and the events surrounding it. Helaena Targaryen's death is one of the most tragic moments in the entire Dance of the Dragons. In House of the Dragon Season 3 Episode 8, viewers finally see Helena's story reach its devastating conclusion. But if you've only watched the show, you may be wondering something even more important. How does Helaena die in the books? Does the show follow Fire and Blood exactly? Why does Helaena take her own life? And what actually pushes her to the edge? The answer is complicated because Fire and Blood gives us several different explanations for Helena's death, and that's very important. The book doesn't present one completely reliable version of events. Instead, different historians provide different theories. So let's go through exactly what happens to Helaena in the book, what caused her death, and how Season 3 changes the story. 1. Who is Helaena Targaryen? Helaena is the daughter of King Viserys I Targaryen and Alicent Hightower. She is also the sister and wife of Aegon II Targaryen. Unlike many of the major players in the dance, Helaena has very little interest in politics. She's not obsessed with the Iron Throne, she doesn't want to command armies, and she isn't trying to manipulate the succession. Instead, Helaena is portrayed as a gentle and unusual member of the royal family. She's also known for making strange statements that sound like riddles. As the story progresses, however, those statements increasingly appear to have prophetic meaning. That becomes particularly important when we look at her death. 2. Helena's life is destroyed by the dance. Before Helaena dies, she experiences some of the most horrifying events of the Civil War. The most important is the murder of her son, Prince Jaehaerys. In the book, the assassins known as Blood and Cheese break into the Red Keep. They force Helaena to choose which of her sons should die. She is placed in an impossible situation. She chooses Maelor, believing that because he is younger, he may be less aware of what is happening. But the assassins kill Jaehaerys instead. This destroys Helaena emotionally. She is left carrying enormous grief and guilt. And from this point onward, her mental state deteriorates. 3. Helaena becomes increasingly isolated. After Jaehaerys' murder, Helaena withdraws from the world around her. She is devastated. She spends much of her time inside her rooms and becomes increasingly disconnected from the political world. This is important because Helaena isn't simply another casualty of the dance. She's someone who is psychologically destroyed by it. The war has taken away her child. Her family is collapsing, and the people around her continue fighting over power. For Helaena, the Iron Throne has become almost meaningless compared with what she has lost. And then another tragedy awaits her. 4. What happens to Maelor? This is one of the biggest differences between the book and the television series. In Fire and Blood, Helaena has another son named Maelor. After Rhaenyra captures King's Landing, Helaena and her children are effectively trapped within the political chaos. Maelor is eventually sent away in an attempt to keep him safe. But while being transported towards safety, he is discovered by a mob. And this becomes one of the most horrific events connected to Helena's eventual death. Maelor is killed. His death is extremely brutal. And according to one of the accounts in Fire and Blood, hearing about what happened to Maelor is what finally pushes Helaena over the edge. But remember, that's not the only explanation in the book. 5. How does Helaena actually die? Eventually, Helaena dies inside the Red Keep. She throws herself from a window in Maegor's Holdfast. She falls into the dry moat below and is impaled on the iron spikes. She is only 21 years old. It's an incredibly brutal death. And while the basic event is clear, the reason behind it is much less certain. The book's historians disagree about exactly why Helaena chose that particular moment to die. That's one of the most fascinating parts of her story. We know what happened, but we don't know with absolute certainty why it happened when it did. 6. Was Maelor's death the reason? One account says that Helaena was driven to suicide after Mysaria, also known as the White Worm, told her that Maelor had been killed. According to this version, Helaena had already suffered unimaginable grief after losing Jaehaerys. Then she learns that her other son has also died. The combination of grief and guilt becomes unbearable. She takes her own life shortly afterward. This explanation has become one of the most widely accepted versions of Helena's death. George R.R. Martin has also previously indicated that Maelor's death and Helena's grief were central to her suicide in the book's intended history. But there's a major problem for the television adaptation. Maelor does not exist in the HBO series, and that means the show cannot simply recreate the book's version exactly. 7. So what does the show change? This is where Season 3, Episode 8 becomes particularly important. The HBO series removes Maelor from Helena's story. Instead, the show builds Helena's final moments around her visions, her trauma, and everything that has happened to her throughout the war. Her prophetic abilities become much more important. She appears to have an understanding of what is coming. And her final scenes connect her personal tragedy with the larger destruction of the Targaryen family. The basic outcome remains the same. Helaena dies by jumping from the window. But the emotional path toward that moment is different. That is one of the major differences between the book and the show. 8. Did Helaena know she was going to die? This is where the show adds another fascinating layer. Helaena has repeatedly demonstrated what appear to be prophetic abilities. She says strange things that later make sense. She seems to know things before they happen. And by Season 3, those visions are closely connected to the future of the Targaryen family. So when Helaena dies, it's difficult not to wonder, did she know this was coming? The show strongly encourages viewers to ask that question. But there's an important distinction. It doesn't necessarily mean that Helaena wanted to die because she had seen her own death. Her visions could have shown her the destruction that was coming. They could have made her realize that she could not escape the future. Or they could simply represent her unusual ability to perceive things other characters cannot. The show deliberately leaves some of that ambiguous. 9. Was Helaena murdered? This is where Fire and Blood gets even more interesting. The official historical account says Helaena committed suicide. But because the book is written like a history assembled from different sources, rumors and alternative explanations appear throughout the story. Some people in King's Landing suspect that Helaena may have been murdered. There are even rumors that Rhaenyra was somehow responsible. But there is no definitive evidence proving that Rhaenyra ordered Helena's death. This is important because Fire and Blood constantly reminds us that history is messy. Different witnesses remember events differently. Some accounts are based on rumor, some are based on political propaganda, and some may simply be wrong. So the book leaves a cloud of uncertainty around Helena's final moments. 10. Another explanation involves the executions. Another account suggests that Helena's suicide was connected to the execution of two men who had attempted to free Corlys Velaryon. According to this version, Helaena witnessed the executions and was emotionally devastated by what she saw. But there are obvious reasons to question this explanation. The historical sources themselves aren't completely convinced that she was actually present. And because Fire and Blood gives us multiple accounts, we're left wondering which version is closest to the truth. That's the fascinating thing about Helena's death. The event itself is certain. The motivation isn't. 11. Why is Helena's death so important? Helena's death has enormous consequences for King's Landing. She is one of the few members of the royal family who is genuinely loved by ordinary people. She's not seen as a ruthless political figure. She's mostly viewed as innocent and sympathetic. So when she dies, the people of King's Landing become even more furious. Her death becomes one of the events contributing to the massive unrest that follows. Eventually, the city's population turns against the Targaryens and their dragons. That leads toward one of the most famous events of the dance, the storming of the dragon pit. So Helena's death isn't simply the end of her personal story. It helps push King's Landing toward rebellion. 12. Why did Helaena jump from the window? If we put everything together, the answer is not simply one event. Helaena has endured years of trauma. She lost Jaehaerys. In the book, she loses Maelor as well. She is surrounded by a brutal civil war. Her family is falling apart. Her children are being used as pieces in a political conflict. And she appears to be psychologically from everything that has happened. The book's different accounts give different immediate reasons for her final decision, but all of them point toward the same broader reality. Helaena has been pushed beyond what she can endure. 13. Why is her book Death different from the show? The biggest difference is Maelor. In Fire and Blood, Maelor's death is a crucial part of the tragedy surrounding Helaena. In the HBO series, Maelor isn't part of the story. That means the writers had to find another emotional path to Helena's final moment. The show instead emphasizes her visions, her trauma, her isolation, and the horrifying future she appears to understand. This is part of a much larger pattern in House of the Dragon. The show frequently changes events from Fire and Blood because the book itself contains contradictory historical accounts. The creators aren't always adapting one definitive version of events. They're choosing which interpretation works best for the television story. Final thoughts. So, how did Helaena Targaryen die in the books? In Fire and Blood, Helaena throws herself from a window in Maegor's Holdfast and falls onto the iron spikes below. But the really interesting question isn't how she died, it's why. And the book deliberately makes that complicated. One explanation says Helaena was driven to suicide after learning that her son Maelor had been killed. Another connects her death to the executions of men involved in the attempt to free Corlys Velaryon. And rumors in King's Landing even suggest that she may have been murdered, although there is no solid proof of that theory. The HBO series takes the same basic outcome but changes the circumstances. Because Maelor doesn't exist in the show, his death cannot be the direct trigger. Instead, the series places much greater emphasis on Helena's prophetic visions and the psychological destruction caused by the dance. And that makes her Season 3 ending especially tragic. Helaena isn't someone who wanted power. She wasn't trying to win the war. She didn't want to rule Westeros. She was simply born into a family that turned itself against itself. And in the end, the war destroys her just as completely as it destroys everyone else. Her death also becomes a turning point for King's Landing. The people lose one of the few Targaryens they genuinely sympathize with. The city's anger grows, and the royal family's control begins to collapse. That's why Helena's death matters far beyond her own story. She becomes another symbol of what the Dance of the Dragons actually costs. Not just crowns, not just castles, not just dragons. People. And perhaps the most heartbreaking part is that Helaena may have been one of the few characters who understood where all of this was heading. She could see pieces of the future. She could recognize the signs, but she couldn't stop the tragedy from happening. And whether you believe the book's explanation involving Maelor, the alternative historical accounts, or the show's interpretation involving Helena's visions, one thing remains the same. Helaena Targaryen was never truly a player in the Game of Thrones. She was one of its greatest victims.